First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. It's great to be at our second annual Stanford Cyber Day program, and we welcome you today at Stanford University. My name is Evan Epstein. I'm one of the co-directors of this program along with Professor George Trantis and Professor Joe Grunfest, and I'm the executive director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance, which is a joint initiative between Stanford Law School and the Stanford Graduate School of Business. But before we start with the program, I'd like to thank a few people and organizations. First, the keynoters. Suzanne Spaulding, who hasn't arrived yet, is the Undersecretary for the National Protection and Programs Directorate of the Department of Homeland Security. And we're sure that the rain may have delayed her coming, but otherwise what we'll do, we'll have the first panel go first, and when she arrives, she will be able to give her address. And also, as you know, October has been designated the Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so I'm sure it's a busy month for everybody in the cybersecurity space. And for the lunch session, we have Professor Michael Bernstein from the Engineering School presenting his joint research with Professors Ramesh Johari and Melissa Valentine on the future of work. And the idea here is to show some of the research that is being conducted at Stanford University with cyber implications, but we also picked that topic on purpose that would not be 100% cybersecurity focused, since we'll have that content throughout the day. Second, I want to thank the Stanford Cyber Initiative, which is the central hub on campus for policy-relevant research across disciplines to address both the opportunities and challenges raised by cyber technologies. And both their co-directors, Professor George Trantis and Dan Bonnet, will be joining us today, and also their executive director, Alison Berkey. I want to thank them for their support, advice, and contribution to this program, making it a unique program among all the other cybersecurity programs for directors of corporations. Third, I want to thank the Stanford Law School Program Group. This event would not be possible without the hard work of our events team, led by Trish Gertridge, Jackie Del Barrio, Jody Carrion, and Casey Limjemko. They will be here helping us throughout the day on any logistical questions. They are really the secret sauce for the success of these Rock Center programs on campus. And fourth, I want to just mention Equilar. You may have all received an email with an app letting you know about the content of the program, the other participants, reading materials. So we encourage you to read the app or download the app and take a look at that. Just a very small story on how this program came together. As some of you know, the Rock Center and Stanford Law School has been hosting many executive education programs for directors and executives of of public companies for over 2 decades now. And as part of these programs, and to Joe Grunfest's credit, we started addressing cybersecurity threat about 7 years ago. But every year, the relevance and importance of this topic kept growing and growing to the point where today it has become, by many measures, the #1 concern for directors of publicly traded corporations. So last year, we decided that it was time to create a program focused exclusively on cybersecurity, taking advantage not only of our law school faculty, but also, and perhaps more importantly, some of our world-class computer science and engineering professors at Stanford who can contribute with technical aspects of cybersecurity on top of our corporate governance expertise. So for this year's program, we have assembled a remarkable group of cybersecurity and corporate governance experts to go through a full day of cybersecurity discussions that we hope will help you understand more deeply these issues. You've all seen the agenda. What we want to do is to analyze a progression of the anatomy of a cyber breach, starting with a discussion of the major forms of threats to corporations and the various forms of defenses, followed by a panel on the legal, regulatory, and insurance issues involving cybersecurity. And after lunch, we'll have discussion on incident response plans, and we'll finish with a tabletop exercise to wrap all these things together. So we believe that Stanford is an academic institution uniquely suited to address these issues, and we're looking forward to a great day of learning. But of course, we appreciate any feedback that you have to make this a better program. And just a couple of additional issues. If you're planning to tweet or write anything about this program, please remember that only our keynotes are opening to being quoted. All the other sessions are subject to Chatham House rule So we expect to have a broad discussion on these topics. So I'll leave you with Professor George Triantis, and if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be here all day as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. I'll be brief because I'll have a couple of other occasions to speak today. As Evan said, I am a co-director along with Professor Dan Bonet of Computer Science of the Stanford Cyber Initiative, and it's a great privilege to be able to co-sponsor this event with the Rock Center. The Rock Center provides the absolutely highest quality in programs, and so it's a real privilege for us. The second thing is that it's appropriate that this be held at a university, that this session be held at a university, partly because of the multidisciplinary strengths of universities in general, but Stanford in particular, but also because the cybersecurity risk is a social risk as well as a private risk. It affects us individually, it affects our corporations, but it also affects all of society. There are many analogies of what cyber attacks are like out there. The one that I tend to like is the idea of a pandemic. And a pandemic is very much a social issue. Evan mentioned that this is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. It's also the month at which many of us get flu shots. Why do we get a flu shot? It's not only in order to protect ourselves, but it's also to protect the people around us and our nation at large. And the same thing is true about cybersecurity. It's not just a matter between you as director and executive and your shareholders, but it's also protecting your employees, your customers, your suppliers, your competitors, like it or not, and in fact society at large. So bearing that in mind, that we are dealing with a social issue is something that is important to do as we proceed today as well. So without further ado, I'd like to call on my colleague, Joe Grundfest, to introduce our first keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Triantis. How many of you are aware of the fact that the United States government has a position which is known as the Undersecretary of Doom, Destruction, and Despair at the Department of Homeland Security? All right? We are fortunate to have with us the Undersecretary for Doom, Destruction, and Despair, formerly known as the Undersecretary for National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security, Suzanne Spaulding. She oversees the coordinated operation and policy functions of the Directorate's subcomponents, which include cybersecurity and communications, infrastructure protection, biometric identity management, cyber and infrastructure analysis, and the Federal Protective Service. Now, if that's your responsibility set, what possibly could go wrong? All right? I mean, it's got to be an easy day every day. Ms. Spaulding has spent 25 years working on national security issues for both Republican and Democratic administrations, and she's worked on both sides of the aisle of Congress. She's led or served on national commissions having to do with terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, and she's served on commissions on cybersecurity and homeland security, convened and participated in numerous academic and professional advisory panels, and we're extraordinarily honored to have her here with us today to address this group.
Joe, thank you very much, and thanks to the Stanford Cyber Initiative and the Rock Center. It's really a delight to be here. I was really pleased to be invited and to have this opportunity to come and talk with all of you. And I like your name, George, Joe, better than the name that we have. National Protection and Programs Directorate is a horrible name. Terrible. I'm not sure, death, destruction, and doom is really quite what we're aiming for. But I am working with Congress to try to change our name to something that tells you what we do. And the name that I would like us to be known by is Cyber and Infrastructure Protection Agency, which I think is a lot better name, don't you think? Yeah. Because that is our mission for that group of activities that Joe described. all of those are geared towards strengthening the security and the resilience of our nation's critical infrastructure. And of course, when we talk about critical infrastructure, we're not just talking about the physical infrastructure of our roads and bridges, but all of those network systems and assets, both physical and virtual, that if they were disrupted would have a debilitating impact on our security, our economic security, our public health and safety. And so it includes things like our financial services sector, includes things like our agriculture sector, emergency services, in addition to chemical facilities and dams and nuclear facilities in the electricity sector. Excuse me, 16 different sectors. I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize in advance. 16 different sectors that we have sort of organized ourselves around just to make things a little more give us an opportunity to get our arms around the vastness of this challenge. But we're also mindful that those critical assets and networks and systems live in a broader ecosystem. And so really our focus in cyber particularly is very broad. And yet what we're engaged in every single day is an exercise in risk management. And that's what all of our activities are designed to help all of our stakeholders. At the federal level, we're responsible for the civilian government, departments and agencies, helping them with their cybersecurity. We work with state and locals, and I'll talk with you a bit about the work we're doing around election infrastructure right now. We work with the private sector. And for all of those folks, what we're trying to do is to assist them in their risk management of the cybersecurity risk. And so it's really something I like to emphasize when I'm talking with C-suite executives. And I try to do that as often as I can because you play such a critical role. And cybersecurity can be intimidating. It's very easy and tempting to cede this to the techies, right? Because it gets very technical very fast. And my fundamental message to you, if you're not a technical person, and we may have some technical folks in the room, but for those of you who are not, is to not be intimidated by this. All of you who are in corporate governance, engage in risk management every day. That's what you do. And that's what this is. And you have to trust your instincts. Bring that same risk management approach to cybersecurity. And so I'm going to talk about kind of how we think about that. When you're looking at how you manage risks, it starts with understanding, making sure that you have as good an understanding as you can of what those risks are. And then you look at all the ways in which you can mitigate those risks. So let's start with that risk assessment. And when we look at risk, how to assess the risks, we traditionally look at as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. It's the likelihood that something will happen and what is the impact if it does. And the likelihood is a combination of that threat and vulnerability, right? Who would want to do something, or what kind of hazards, what kinds of things might be coming at you? And then what are your weaknesses or vulnerabilities that could exploit? That tells you, the likelihood, gives you a sense of the likelihood of that risk. In cybersecurity, we have spent a lot of time looking at threat and vulnerability. That's mostly what you hear about, or at least traditionally have heard about in cybersecurity. So I will talk to you a bit about, our assessment of the threat and some of the sources of the vulnerabilities. But increasingly, we've realized that you really have to spend a significant effort understanding the consequences. Because the threats are pretty ubiquitous, the vulnerabilities are vast, and to help you prioritize your efforts, what you really care about, you've got to be focused on what could have the greatest impact. And that is something that all of you are in a position to evaluate. And it's one of the reasons why I say we cannot leave cybersecurity to the IT, to the techies, because they're not alone in a position to tell you about consequences. So when you want to have this conversation about cybersecurity, you have to call to the table your program people. your engineers, your marketing people, your financial folks, your lawyers, all of your risk and enterprise risk folks, and start the conversation with what are the kinds of disruptions that would really have a significant impact on our company. And then, which of those might be caused by a cyber incident? And now, when you go to look at how do we mitigate those, you're now looking at, there's technology ways you can mitigate, but there may be other ways you can mitigate consequences, right? But if you don't have all those people at the table, you're not going to come to that solution. This is something I feel very passionate about, and I argue this all the time back in Washington, because there are, in the government, at the national level, there are voices that say we've got to bring all our cyber folks together and have a cyber agency and just focus on the cyber ones and zeros in the technology. And I keep reminding them how wonderful it is that an organization like mine exists, where we have both the physical security, and we have folks all across the country every day meeting with and working with critical infrastructure owners and operators, understanding their business, as well as our cyber ninjas, our technical experts, some of the best and the brightest in the world. And we have to make sure that they are talking to each other every single day and informing each other. You can't have good physical security anymore without being conscious of cybersecurity. Those surveillance cameras that you put in that are networked, that an adversary can now get in and use for their own purposes, right? Access controls on doors that are increasingly sophisticated and networked. And similarly, if you don't have physical access controls to your server room, your information and communications technology is at risk from that insider physical access, right? So you've got to think of these as something that that are inexorably intertwined and go hand in hand. So let's go back to the threats. So that you can think about the threat in a number of ways. Think about the threat in terms of the variety of motivations that folks have out there who are bad actors in cyberspace, right? So I worry a lot about people with destructive intent, which you might call saboteurs, right? Because we know that you can get remote access to industrial control systems that actually control machines, valves, turbines, etc., and have physical consequences that could be very significant. You can also just destroy computers, turn them into bricks, and wipe out all of your data. So there are folks who are out there with destructive intent, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There's espionage. We read about that every single day. There's nation-state espionage, and there's economic espionage, frankly, between economic competitors in business. And that is really about the theft of intellectual property or sensitive business information or key national security information. We distinguish in the United States between traditional kind of nation-state spy versus spy collection of national security information, which has been going on since the dawn of man and woman, and industrial espionage, economic espionage, where a country uses its apparatus to steal information to benefit one of its companies. That we do not do, and we don't think any country should do that. That is really threatens the global marketplace and our efforts broadly to have a level playing field for economic competition around the world. So, big breakthrough last fall when, after an all-night session with a Chinese delegation, we were able to get the Chinese, for the first time, to join us in making that distinction. Prior to that, their view had been, listen, you may not do that, but for us, economic competitiveness is a national security issue, and we reserve the right to steal information. They never admitted that they did it, but they didn't see the distinction. They then agreed, and President Xi made a public statement that they would sign up for this peacetime norm, that a country should not steal economic information, sensitive business information, to give competitive advantage to their companies. Now, does that mean on that day all economic espionage from China stopped? Probably not. But I do think it was a significant step forward, and if nothing else, it significantly raises the cost to them of getting caught, right? And that raises the cost. That means they have to be, if they want to continue to do economic espionage, they have to be much more targeted, and they have to be much more stealthy. And there is, may sound odd, but there is actually benefit to that in terms of reducing. And in fact, if you read reports from companies like FireEye, there's been a precipitous decline in the activity that they're seeing, and they're very, very good from China. So I think it does have an impact. I think they have made a calculus, a cost-benefit analysis. They want to be viewed as credible players on the world stage. So we've got espionage. You've got financial crime. That's a huge part of what we're seeing. And they're very sophisticated actors often. Organized crime are very capable actors in cyberspace. And you see whether it's the theft of PII information being used for financial purposes, increasingly theft of medical information that is being used for all kinds of fraud for financial gain, ransomware, lots of financial, a lot of money to be made in cybercrime. And then there are hacktivists, sort of ideologues, politically motivated or ideologically motivated folks, and that's primarily what we see there is website defacements, but also denial of service attacks, where they will shut down a website by flooding it with incoming. And we'll talk about that in a minute. That's what we saw with Dyn over last week, when among other things, the Internet of Things, devices on the Internet of Things were harnessed into a botnet to attack a DNS, a company very important to the backbone of the Internet, connecting people with websites, and was able to bring that down for a number of hours. And then the terrorists, which I put in the saboteurs category. So those are kind of the motivations that we see out there for cyber. That's one way to think about the threat. Another way to think about the threat is to, we look at the actors, the key actors, particularly nation-state actors, the ones we worry about most: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. I like to think of this as kind of a quadrant. If you think of a graph, with destructive intent along one line and capability along another, right? Right now, we're, for the most part, those with the greatest capability have the least destructive intent. And those with the most destructive intent have lower capabilities. But we take no real comfort in that, because we are very aware that at any moment, any of those points could move into this right-hand quadrant here of high destructive intent and high capability. Folks with lower capability today are gaining capability every single day. The tools are out there. This tool that was used in part to carry out this attack last week was put out on open source for anyone to download and use. So their capabilities, they're moving in this direction all the time. The folks down here who today seem to have destructive intent, depending on what's happening in the real world, could flip up into that right quadrant at any time. So, and I put organized crime really in the low destructive intent and relatively high capability as well. And of course, you never know when they're just going to offer their capabilities for sale. So that's kind of a quick overview of the threat picture. In terms of thinking about your vulnerabilities, you have to think about not just your IT, but think about your processes and your people, right? All of those are potential vulnerabilities, and not necessarily in that order. Your people are oftentimes your greatest vulnerability. What we see more than anything else, the vector in to these networks, is somebody clicked on a phishing email. right? So we're working hard to train our workforce to recognize and not click on those emails that come in. Don't click on the attachment. Don't click on that link. So TSA recently did a test of its employees, sent out a message that said, free Redskins tickets. And in Washington, that's a big deal. You've won free Redskins tickets. Click on the link below to see, how to pick up your tickets. And when they clicked on the link, it took them to a site that said, come to room, 290, Monday morning at 9 o'clock to get your tickets. You can imagine what was awaiting them in room 290 on Monday morning, remedial training on how not to click on spear phishing emails. But that it really is, it seems crazy, and frankly, we're never gonna, if a determined adversary is targeting you particularly, they're gonna craft what we call spear phishing emails. They're gonna craft a very tailored email, and you're probably gonna fall for it because it's just really hard to distinguish them. So everything that I talk about here, they're all pieces. It's all part of a layered defense, right? We're never going to eliminate the risk of people clicking on emails. But most of the time, they're not that clever, and they're broadly disseminated, and we really can. And we have noticed a decline in the number of folks who click on these as we do these trainings. So it's definitely worth doing. Processes. One of the most important steps you can take is multi-factor authentication. Right? So don't just rely on a password and all of the things that you hear. If you're going to have passwords, don't use the default password. That was one of the big lessons from last week's attack as well, that a lot of these devices on the Internet of Things, nobody changes the password. It's still the default password that it came out of the box with, and the adversary knows what those are. And so they just have a library of them, and they run through them, and they find the right one. It's often password, and they're in. So complicated passwords, change them often, but also have a second form of authentication. And most often, for us in the government, it's a PIV card. It's a card that you have to put into the computer, so it shows you're physically there. But a lot of times it'll be a token with numbers that change randomly. But have two forms of authentication, very important. And then obviously there are the technology kinds of things that you need to put in place. You need to make sure that you have an appropriate perimeter defense. You've got to make sure that your system, talk to your IT folks about making sure that your system is, that you're updating patches personally. Make sure that when those notices pop up and say there are updates available, that you download those updates, because those are often addressing vulnerabilities that have been discovered, that adversaries have taken advantage of. And so you want to download those patches, those fixes to address those vulnerabilities. You want your, in your corporate networks, you want to make sure that they're segmented. You want to make sure that the only people who have free run of the entire network are those very small number of people who absolutely have to have that administrative privileges. Not everybody needs to do that. And make sure that as people leave, you're really getting that access, shutting down their access to the system, basic things. So that's addressing your vulnerabilities. We talked a bit about consequences, right? So one way to think about consequences, how do I assess the consequences of a cyber incident? Think about the ways in which your business depends on data, right? So not just confidentiality of that data, but you want to think about what would be the harm to your reputation, for example, if all your customer data was suddenly on the internet being sold. But also your ability to access that data, right? So increasingly we see ransomware attacks. And so if you suddenly couldn't access this data, what kind of impact would that have? And over what period of time would you need to not have access to that data for it to begin to have a real impact on you? And then finally, reliability. Can you rely on the accuracy of that data? What if that data is corrupted in ways that you can quickly detect, or perhaps in ways that you can't? quickly detect, right? So in the context of data, think about your business and all the ways in which those things could have a real significant impact. And then finally, the industrial control systems. If you run machines, you've got operational activity, SCADA systems. You know, if you rely on remote access to monitor cameras, to monitor machinery, to monitor events, think about if that was disrupted, corrupted, taken over by an adversary. So that helps you then prioritize what are the things we care about most. Basic cyber hygiene, there are basic things you can do that I talked about earlier that you need to just do as a matter of course. But it's never going to give you 100% protection. So that's why you've got to figure out what are your crown jewels? What are the things you really care about? Now let's focus on those, right? So think about, you know, what are some of the IT process people things you can do? But also, what are some of the non-cyber things you could do to mitigate those consequences? I always try to remind my folks that in some instances, the most cost-effective return on investment to protect against significant consequences from a cyber event might be to put in a hand crank, might be to have paper ballots, right? So a year ago, 2 days before Christmas, December 23rd, bitter cold, an adversary, a cyber attack, took out the electric grid for 250,000 people. Didn't happen here, it happened in Ukraine, but it was very significant. First time really that we've seen and been able to identify an adversary cyber attack on critical infrastructure that civilian populations depend upon. They got the power back up within 6 hours, not because their IT folks got the system back up. In fact, last I checked, they still didn't have full network capabilities restored. They got the system back up because they had the old guys who knew how the grid was laid out, and when the adversaries had come in and through remote access had flipped all these breakers, well, these guys knew where the breakers were, and they got in trucks, they drove out to the breakers, and they manually moved them back in place, and they got the power back on. Our electric grid is really far more resilient right now than people give it credit for, because most of it was built in the 1970s before we added all this cyber dependence, and the cyber efficiencies were tacked on, so that a lot of that physical redundancy is still there. But a lot of that stuff is nearing the end of its useful life, and it's being upgraded to the smart grid. So as we do that, we work very closely with the energy sector, and particularly the electricity sector. I meet with CEOs from the electricity sector 3 or 4 times a year and talk with them even more often about the ways in which we need to make sure that we're building in cybersecurity as they do that, and that we're ready for things that might happen. So that's kind of how what we bring to this then is to try to help our stakeholders understand what are the risks, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the best practices, what are the things that they should be doing. And then we also have a role in incident response. So if something does happen, we're kind of like the firefighters. We come in and we help put out the fire. We figure out, okay, stop the damage, help you kick the adversary off the system, and now how are you going to recover and restore and rebuild more securely? And then we take the information with the permission of the victim, the target. We take that information, we anonymize it, and we get it out as broadly as we can to everyone who might benefit from it, so that what happened to them hopefully will not happen to you. And that's a key piece that we've gotten much better at, but need to keep working on, this information sharing. It's sort of like the see something, say something for cyber, or neighborhood watch, if you will. We've got to get better and better at that, at sharing that information about what each of us is seeing to the benefit of all of us, because we're only as strong as our weakest link. Target was breached because their HVAC vendor was breached, right? So we have developed machine-to-machine capability for sharing of cyber threat information. that is machine readable. We can share it in milliseconds. Congress has given us the authority to grant liability protection for companies who share cyber threat indicators with us. We take those indicators, again, we anonymize those, and we push them out to everyone who's participating in automated information sharing. So I would encourage all of you to look into this and to really consider signing up to receive those indicators. The idea here is, and you get liability protection for sharing private to private, in addition to sharing with our Ops Center at DHS. So the idea here is to have a network of networks, right? It's not just spoken hub. And when any node in that network of networks is pinged by an adversary, they immediately send that like a bolo alert to everyone in the network. And everyone can block, and the adversary can only get away with using that once. And that would be a huge step forward. Today, the adversary can reuse the same tactics, techniques, and procedures, the same infrastructure, the same IP addresses over and over and over and over again, for years sometimes, because we aren't sharing efficiently enough. So this will really make a big difference. So those are some of the resources that we bring to bear to try to help you. And we've got on our website, for example, a set of questions for CEOs to ask their IT team. But again, I encourage you to trust your instincts. If you're CEOs or if you're the risk official in your corporation, C-suite official, executive, and you're asking these questions, you may not know exactly what the answer should be, but just as you do in all other kinds of other contexts, you can get a sense of whether, in fact, there is a solid plan in place, whether there's that everybody understands what's the threshold for an incident that should be brought to your attention, right? Are the CISO, CIO, and CSO, Chief Security Officer, talking to each other? How are we evaluating our risks, and how are we mitigating them? Right? All of the work that we do is on a voluntary basis, and so trust is really important to us. If we can't maintain the trust between us and the private sector or our other stakeholders, we're out of business. So I have a privacy officer who is right at my joint at the hip with me, and they're involved in the development of all of our programs as we go forward. We have privacy impact assessments, which we do on all of our cybersecurity programs. They're posted on the internet. They're posted on our website so that people can see what we're doing, why we're doing it. We also have the responsibility to protect sensitive information that businesses share with us, their vulnerabilities, the fact that they've had an incident, right? No, they're very reluctant to have that get out. We have a regime Congress gave us called PCII, Protected Critical Infrastructure Information. It requires us to protect this information. We cannot give it to regulators. And that's a big deal to companies. I don't want to, particularly regulated industries, right? I don't want to talk to you about this because I'm worried that the regulators will come after me and I'll be victimized twice. We cannot give it to regulators. We cannot hand it over under FOIA. We cannot hand it over under civil litigation, right? We can only share it with people who are trained. So we really, again, encourage you to reach out. Eric Goldstein of my staff is here and can give you the website because we keep changing it. us-cert.gov for automated information sharing in particular, it's /AIS. But otherwise, us-cert.gov will get you to resources that are, available to you at no charge. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you. It's us-cert, CERT.gov. So I'm going to stop there because I probably have spoken longer than I meant to, and I really want to make sure I've hit the things that you were hoping to hear. And take your questions, comments, thoughts, concerns. Yes?
Offer an example of the types of information that are protected against FOI and so on.
Yes. So it's any sensitive business information that's shared with us. So yes, she was asking for an example of the kind of information that would be protected under this PCI regime. So what Congress really had in mind at the time was principally vulnerability information. So we understood back in 2002 that we were entering into a new kind of relationship, government and the private sector. Understanding that critical infrastructure was being targeted and was critically important to our nation, and 85% of it is owned by the private sector. So we had to be working in true partnership with the private sector. We had to be able to come together around a table and just share openly and candidly with each other. So we also have a private sector clearance program where we give clearances to subject matter experts who work in the private sector, and we call them in periodically to read the intelligence with us. Say, here's what we've got, here's what we see, here's what we think this is telling us, what do you see? You're the experts. And then help us craft an unclassified alert that can go out more broadly to all of the folks out there who could benefit from this information, right? So understanding that two-way conversation needed to happen and that businesses need to be comfortable saying, here's our vulnerabilities, can you help us understand them and fix them? They created this regime. Yeah.
So I love your a holistic way you're framing this as cyber infrastructure. How are you advising the facilities management folks, especially as they install sensors and new automated systems within smart buildings or smart cities? How are you working also with the property insurers and casualty insurers to be picking up some of these risks?
Yeah. Thank you, particularly for the latter question, because it's one of the points I wanted to cover. The URL I gave you is our U.S. computer emergency response team, but we also have an industrial control systems cert, and they're out in Idaho Falls, and they are the world's experts on industrial control systems and all of the vulnerabilities and mitigations. So they publish a whole series of guides and best practices for everything from, surveillance cameras and access controls across the board. And they work with companies, manufacturers, et cetera, all the time to help them and help us understand it and help them understand it and see if we can help them build in security more effectively. So that's one of the key ways that we do that. And we also have, I do have the Federal Protective Service as part of my organization. They protect 9,000 federal facilities all across the country. And so increasingly they're bringing that cyber expertise. We're loaning from our cyber ninjas to them to look at the same sorts of things. So we have, if you will, our own laboratories to look at that. So we recognized a number of years ago that the insurance market, one of the things we really focus on is how, in addition to this sort of retail, working with critical infrastructure owners and operators all across the country, to achieve scale, we need to move big parts of the market, right? And so we look at how are the ways in which we can help the market to be more efficient in this area. And insurance is clearly one of those ways. Insurance helps the market to be more efficient. We recognize that there's a pretty good third-party cybersecurity insurance market. That is to say, when your customer's information is stolen. We've all of us now have free credit reporting, right? Like 2 or 3 times over, because we've all gotten those letters, right, in the mail. Your information was stolen. We have an obligation to notify you, and we have to give you free credit reporting. That's because of 48, 49 state laws. We're working on having a harmonized federal law, but right now state laws require the breach notification. First-party insurance is much harder. In other words, insuring a company against the damage to the company itself. Mostly because companies don't talk about it. So there's not data out there around which insurance companies can build products. If you will, there's no actuarial data, or very little. And so as we brought together insurers and academics and victims and folks in the private sector to talk about this, we realized that there could be tremendous benefit if we could get more data out there. So some people have said, well, mandate that companies have to report, incidents that don't, even if they don't involve theft of PII. I think that's really hard and very hard to enforce. What we have proposed instead, and we have a Cyber Incident Data Analysis Working Group, CDOG, is the idea of having a third-party repository where companies could provide, again, anonymously, it would not be government, it would be a private sector, provide data about incidents. And we've worked over the last several years to identify the kinds of data that would be most valuable. And that would be available, in my mind, it should be public. It would be available for researchers, but it would be available for insurance companies, it would be available for companies. And that, I think, could really help promote a more robust cyber insurance market.
We have time only for one last question.
Yes?
You said you were going to talk about either the security or the vulnerability of our voting system.
Yes.
You didn't say.
Thank you. Thank you. So with the hack into the DNC and the DCCC, which we now are confident was done by the Russian government and approved at very senior levels with the intent of interfering with our election. And so that really got a lot of attention, as you might imagine. And so the work that we have been doing over the years with our colleagues across the federal government and state and local around election infrastructure really took on a new sense of urgency. And so we started looking and did our own assessment of, okay, if someone is trying to interfere in our elections, what are all the things we should be thinking about, right? So we did an assessment of what are the pieces of that election infrastructure, from voter registration databases to voting machines, to tabulation and counting, to reporting. And what we assessed is that it would be extremely difficult for a malicious actor to actually affect the vote total. Despite all that you've read about the ability to hack into a voting machine in 7 minutes or whatever, the reality is that our election system is done at the local level. It's managed at the local level. It's incredibly diverse and diffused. So a variety of different kinds of machines. They are not connected to the internet, these voting machines. So it requires physical access to those machines. Those machines are safeguarded. They have physical security around them. They are tested and certified in the run-up to the election. Many states have, all states have a variety of processes, audit trails, et cetera, in place. 41 of the states have some kind of paper trail, whether it's a paper ballot that's scanned or printed. And those that don't have other ways of auditing and going back in. So the ability of, you'd really have to have, if you think about it, you'd have to have an army of people who somehow gain physical access to a voting machine and are able to tamper with that machine, to change enough votes to have an impact on the national outcome. And our assessment, and that of the other experts who have looked at this, is that that's really not a likely outcome. That is highly, highly unlikely. However, what we worry about is the things that face the internet, like voter registration databases. And we've seen a couple intrusions into state voter registration databases. And that has the potential to cause disruption, right? Ultimately, if somebody shows up to vote and they're not on the, like somebody went in and removed a bunch of names from the database and people were showing up to vote and their names weren't on the list, you get a provisional ballot and we can sort that out afterwards because there are other records and ultimately you're going to be able to reconcile that. But it would be disruptive on election day. And so we're working with state and local officials across the country to offer our services to help them do everything they could do to make sure that those systems are secure. Right? And we are preparing for a rapid response on election day should things come up. Similarly, across the totaling of reporting of election results, both within secretaries of state and in the media, because what we're most concerned about is some disruption that causes a loss in confidence among the American public about the validity of the outcome of the election. And so we're walking this fine line between making sure that we're doing everything we can do to secure these systems and to build confidence in the security of these systems and be able to attest to that without alarming people. And so that's an effort we have very much underway right now, working in conjunction with the Election Assistance Commission, with the Department of Justice, and as I say, with state and local officials on a voluntary basis.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let me just say again, thanks to all of you for taking time to be here. It looks like a great agenda, and it's a testament to the seriousness with which you take this issue. So as someone who has the responsibility for this mission and depends on you to get it done, I want to say thank you.